The green carnation that Oscar Wilde and his circle wore to the premiere of Lady Windermere's Fan in 1892 wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a deliberate act of rebellion that would later be used as evidence in the trial that destroyed him. In Victorian Britain, flowers could convey messages of love, loyalty, jealousy, destroy your reputation, end your engagement, or even serve as a declaration of war, all without a single word being spoken.
The mystery of the language of flowers.
A beautifully arranged Victorian bouquet appears before you. Delicate roses nestled amongst forget-me-nots, a sprig of basil tucked discreetly behind a yellow carnation, all bound with a blue ribbon tied to the left. To our modern eyes, it's simply a lovely arrangement. But to a Victorian recipient, well, that's quite another matter entirely. In Victorian England, receiving such a bouquet could be cause for delight or utter dread. Behind each petal and stem lay a secret language, where a seemingly innocent gift might contain declarations of love, warnings of danger, or even devastating insults. A charming arrangement I just described. It roughly translates to, "I'll always remember our passionate love, but I've grown to hate you, and I'm rather disappointed you don't feel the same." Not exactly the sort of message one expects to receive with one's morning tea, is it? The story of how Britain became obsessed with floral codes begins not with flowers at all, but with a remarkably adventurous aristocrat. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu was not your typical 18th century noblewoman. Whilst accompanying her husband on his diplomatic mission to Constantinople in 1717, she became fascinated by a Turkish tradition called selam. This wasn't just any communication system. The selam was a secret language where objects, not just flowers, mind you, but small trinkets, fruits, seeds, even pieces of cloth, were exchanged to convey messages that couldn't be spoken aloud in the restrictive confines of Ottoman harems. Lady Mary wrote home in wonder,
"There is no colour, no flower, no weed, no fruit, herb, pebble or feather that has not a verse belonging to it. And you may quarrel, reproach or send letters of passion, friendship or civility, or even of news, without ever inking your fingers."
Imagine that. An entire text message conversation conducted without a single emoji or typing error. Rather refreshing when you think about it. Upon her return to England, Lady Mary introduced this concept to British high society, where it fell on remarkably fertile ground. The British, you see, have always had a particular talent for taking foreign concepts and making them thoroughly, quintessentially British, rather like what we've done with tea or indeed the sandwich. Over the decades that followed, this imported tradition evolved from exotic curiosity to codified Victorian practice. By the time young Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, the selam had transformed into something distinctly British. Floriography, the language of flowers. To understand why Victorians became so utterly obsessed with a secret flower language, one must first understand Victorian society itself, a world of rigid social constraints. Imagine, if you will, a society where a young man and woman could scarcely exchange 2 sentences without a chaperone hovering nearby, where expressing romantic interest directly was considered shockingly forward, and where even the positioning of one's walking stick or how one folded a newspaper could be laden with social meaning. The Victorians lived in a world absolutely drowning in unspoken rules. You couldn't simply say what you meant. Good heavens, no. That would be far too straightforward. Instead, every interaction was governed by an elaborate social choreography that left little room for genuine emotional expression. Yet paradoxically, this was also an era of remarkable scientific curiosity. The Victorians were positively mad about botany. Plant collecting wasn't merely a hobby, it was a national obsession. Exotic specimens poured in from across the expanding British Empire. Conservatories became status symbols, and even modest homes boasted carefully tended gardens. This collision between a society that couldn't speak its feelings aloud and a culture obsessed with cataloguing and collecting plants created the perfect conditions for floriography to flourish. If you couldn't say it with words, perhaps you could say it with flowers instead. The first formal dictionary of this floral language appeared not in England, but in France. In 1819, Charlotte de la Tour, a pseudonym, mind you, for Louise Cottambert, published Le Langage des Fleurs, which quickly became a sensation across the Channel. The British, never ones to be outdone in matters of gardening or subtle social communication, rapidly produced their own versions. By the 1830s and 40s, floriography dictionaries had become absolute bestsellers throughout Britain. These weren't obscure publications gathering dust on library shelves. They were the Victorian equivalent of having the latest smartphone app. Ladies and gentlemen alike carried pocket editions to decode the bouquets they received or compose their own floral messages. Publishers competed to produce the most comprehensive guides, with increasingly elaborate meanings and ever more specific distinctions between varieties. Of course, this led to a rather significant problem. With dozens of competing dictionaries, each assigning slightly different meanings to the same flowers, one person's declaration of undying devotion could be another's expression of mild appreciation. Nevertheless, certain standard meanings did emerge. Red roses for passionate love, forget-me-nots for true remembrance, yellow carnations for disappointment and rejection. These became the vocabulary basics of this silent language. But the meaning wasn't conveyed by the flower alone. How you presented it mattered enormously. A flower offered upright conveyed a positive meaning, while the same bloom presented upside down meant the opposite. A ribbon tied to the right signified love from the giver, while a ribbon tied to the left meant love from the recipient. How did Victorians learn this elaborate code? Much as we might learn any language, through a combination of formal study and practical experience. Young ladies were often given floriography dictionaries as coming-of-age presents. They would study these texts, comparing meanings across different publications and discussing interpretations with friends. Mothers passed knowledge to daughters, adding family traditions and personal associations to the published meanings. But the true education came through practice. Imagine the excitement of receiving your first significant bouquet, perhaps from an admirer following a dance. You'd rush home, flowers clutched carefully, to consult your dictionary and decode the message hidden among the blooms. Was that sprig of ivy a declaration of fidelity? Did the inclusion of a single red rose hint at budding passion? Why were those violets positioned that way? Each bouquet became a puzzle to solve, a secret message to decrypt. For the Victorians, this wasn't merely a charming pastime, it was a vital social skill. The ability to both compose and interpret floral messages could determine one's success in matters of the heart and in broader society. And sometimes, as we'll discover, it could convey warnings that might save one from a disastrous match or a dangerous situation when no other form of communication was possible. But before we venture into those darker territories, what exactly was in Queen Victoria's wedding bouquet? And why did her floral choice establish a tradition that continues in royal weddings to this day?
Decoding the romantic language.
If you think modern dating is complicated, with its swiping this way or that, and unwritten rules about how quickly to respond to messages spare a thought for the Victorians. Their courtship rituals were a veritable minefield of social protocols. Young unmarried women were rarely, if ever, left alone with potential suitors. Conversations at balls and social gatherings happened under the watchful eyes of chaperones, usually mothers, aunts, or married older sisters who monitored every exchanged glance and casual comment. Many a promising romance could be nipped in the bud if a gentleman dared ask of a young lady's interest in landscape painting without proper introduction. Physical contact was strictly limited to the formal touching of gloved hands during dances, or the brief moment when a gentleman might assist a lady into a carriage. Expressing romantic interest directly was considered shockingly forward. Even writing and sending letters could be problematic. Correspondence between unmarried men and women was heavily scrutinized, if permitted at all. Enter Floriography, the perfect solution to this communication conundrum. Flowers could be exchanged in public, displayed openly, even discussed in company, without raising eyebrows. Yet beneath this innocent exterior lay the possibility of expressing the most intimate feelings. A carefully composed bouquet could convey what words could not. I think of you constantly. My heart aches when we're apart. Meet me by the garden gate at midnight, or even, your brother disapproves of me, but I remain devoted. The thrill of this secret communication, composing messages that could be read by only those who understood the code, added an element of excitement to the otherwise strictly controlled courtship process. It was the Victorian equivalent of a private chat channel in a monitored communication system. When young Queen Victoria married her beloved Albert in February 1840, her bridal bouquet contained a single flower variety, snowdrops, that communicated hope, innocence, and purity. For her head, she chose a wreath of orange blossoms, to which her long lace veil was attached. In the language of flowers, orange blossoms symbolized purity, eternal love, and, rather importantly for a royal marriage, fertility. These delicate white flowers from citrus trees carried the promise of fruitfulness, both literally and figuratively. Victoria's choice wasn't revolutionary. Orange blossoms had been associated with weddings since ancient times, but her prominent use of them in the most talked-about wedding of the era elevated them to must-have status for Victorian brides across all social classes. The young queen's passion for floriography extended far beyond her wedding day. Her journals reveal a woman who took genuine delight in both giving and receiving symbolic floral gifts. She and Albert regularly exchanged meaningful bouquets, with pressed specimens preserved in her personal albums alongside notations of their significance. When Albert gifted her with lily of the valley each spring, symbolizing the return of happiness, Victoria understood it as a renewal of their deep bond. After his untimely death, she continued to place these same flowers beside his portrait each year, a poignant floral message to a husband who could no longer receive it. Victoria's embrace of floriography helped cement it as more than a passing fad. If the Queen herself communicated through flowers, then surely this was a respectable and even admirable practice. Her influence spread throughout British society and across the empire, standardizing certain flower meanings and elevating floriography from secret code to cultural phenomenon. At the heart of romantic floriography was a curious little item known as a tussie-mussy, a small, carefully arranged bouquet where every element carried meaning. These weren't the large, showy arrangements we might picture today, but rather compact poses that could be easily carried, presented, and even worn. These nosegays originated well before the era, as practical accessories carried to mask the scent of the streets and body odor, often composed of fragrant herbs and flowers such as lavender, lemon balm, and roses. By the 16th century, their purpose had evolved, and during the Victorian era, they became popular as romantic tokens with elaborate symbolic meanings. The construction of a tussie-mussy followed specific rules. At its center would be a single focal flower expressing the primary message, perhaps a red rose for passionate love or a daisy for loyal affection. Surrounding this central bloom would be secondary flowers providing context or additional messages. Herbs and foliage formed the outer layer, adding nuance or background information. The entire arrangement would be bound with ribbon, the color and tying method of which carried its own significance. A white ribbon might indicate pure intentions, while a gold ribbon might suggest wealth and prosperity. These miniature masterpieces of meaning weren't merely messages, they were also fashion accessories. Ladies would carry them as they made social calls or attended events, often in specialized metal holders called posy holders or bouquetiers that could be pinned to dresses or carried in the hand. Some of these holders were remarkably elaborate, crafted from silver or gold, occasionally adorned with precious stones, and sometimes featuring small hidden water reservoirs to keep the flowers fresh throughout an evening of socializing. How a tussie-mussy was presented added yet another layer of meaning. Offered with the right hand, it conveyed yes to a question, perhaps an acceptance of romantic intentions. Presented with the left hand, it meant no, a rejection that could be delivered without a single uncomfortable word being spoken. Let me share with you how a floral courtship might have unfolded between two young Victorians in the 1850s under the watchful eyes of chaperones. After their first meeting at a summer garden party, Thomas sent Emily a carefully arranged tussie-mussy. At its center was a purple violet, symbolizing thoughts occupied with love. This was surrounded by sprigs of lemon balm for sympathy and phlox for our souls are united. The arrangement was bound with a simple white ribbon, indicating pure intentions. Emily's response, delivered 3 days later, an appropriate waiting period to show interest without seeming overeager, was equally meaningful. She sent a small arrangement centered around a white violet. Let's take a chance on happiness. Surrounded by maidenhair fern signifying secret bond, and a touch of rosemary for remembrance. Her ribbon was also white, but tied in a lover's knot, suggesting reciprocated feelings. Over the following months, their floral conversation evolved. When Thomas was required to travel to Scotland on business, he sent Emily a forget-me-not, true love, jonquil, return my affection, and cedar leaf, I live for thee, clearly communicating his feelings despite the coming separation. Emily's mother, acting as chaperone and guardian of propriety, was present at every exchange of these bouquets. Yet she remained blissfully unaware that under her watchful eye, the young couple had progressed from mutual interest to something approaching an understanding, all without a single compromising word being spoken. The culmination of this floral courtship came when Thomas presented Emily with a tussie-mussy containing orange blossoms, myrtle for love in absence, and ivy for fidelity and marriage. This wasn't merely a bouquet, it was a proposal, one that Emily accepted by sending back a single perfect red rosebud, symbolizing pure and lovely love. Of course, timing mattered enormously. Sending a red rose too early in an acquaintance would be considered shockingly forward, rather like proposing marriage on a first date today. The language of flowers may have been secret, but it still had to observe proper social progression. But what happens when flowers aren't used to express love, but something far darker? How might a seemingly beautiful bouquet conceal a devastating message or a carefully crafted insult?
The darker side of floriography.
Not all floral messages conveyed love and affection. In the hands of a skilled practitioner, floriography could be weaponized, a bouquet becoming as cutting as any blade, yet leaving no visible wound. Imagine receiving a gorgeous arrangement of flowers, presented with all the appearance of a thoughtful gift. You display it prominently, perhaps even thank the giver enthusiastically, only to discover later that hidden within those beautiful blooms was a devastating criticism or a calculated insult. This was the darker genius of floriography. The same system that allowed for secret expressions of love also permitted the delivery of messages that could never be spoken aloud in polite society, all while maintaining the veneer of proper Victorian etiquette. What made these floral weapons so effective was their deniability. If the recipient took offense, the sender could simply express surprise. Perhaps the meaning had been misinterpreted, or the recipient was consulting a different floriography dictionary. After all, wasn't it just a lovely bouquet of flowers? This plausible deniability created a psychological battlefield where the most devastating attacks could be launched with perfect impunity. It was brilliant, calculating, and utterly Victorian, a system where one could be thoroughly nasty while remaining impeccably polite. When it came to matters of the heart, floriography offered a way to deliver rejection without the awkwardness of direct refusal. The yellow carnation stands as perhaps the most notorious flower in this category. Its meaning, disappointment and rejection, was widely recognized across most floriography dictionaries. Receiving one in a bouquet sent an unmistakable message. Your romantic intentions are not welcome. Striped carnations conveyed an even harsher message. I cannot be with you. Geraniums suggested stupidity, while tansies could declare war. Despite its culinary popularity, basil symbolized hatred in the Victorian flower language. But the position of flowers could transform meanings entirely. A flower presented upside down conveyed the opposite of its usual meaning. Thus, an inverted red rose didn't symbolize love, but rather, you have disappointed me, or even my feelings have changed. This inversion principle added layers of complexity to floral communication. A bouquet of otherwise positive flowers, if presented inverted, became a devastating rejection or criticism. The recipient would need to note not just which flowers were included, but exactly how they were positioned. You can imagine the anxiety this might produce. Was that rose slightly tilted because it was meant to be inverted, or had it simply shifted during delivery? Victorian flower recipients likely spent hours analyzing the precise angle of each bloom, rather like scrutinizing punctuation in your DMs, or lack thereof, for hidden meanings. Beyond romantic rejection, floriography provided a perfect vehicle for social criticism and class warfare. The Victorian upper classes, constrained by rigid etiquette from direct confrontation, developed floral arrangements into an art form of passive-aggressive communication. A hostess might send a departing guest a bouquet containing foxglove, insincerity, and meadowsweet, uselessness, effectively saying, your visit was insincere, and added nothing of value while appearing to offer a parting gift. A rival might present a new debutante with an arrangement featuring lavender, distrust, and yellow roses, jealousy, warning others about her character while seeming to welcome her to society. Class dimensions added another layer to this floral warfare. Access to exotic or out-of-season blooms was a privilege of wealth. The upper classes could import flowers from across the empire or grow them in expensive, heated conservatories, while the working class was limited to locally available, seasonal options. knowledge of the code itself became a class marker. The ability to compose and interpret complex floral messages demonstrated education and social standing. Those unfamiliar with the nuances might miss subtle insults or unintentionally send inappropriate messages. This created a social minefield where the wealthy could effectively speak a language partially inaccessible to those of lower status. Allow me to tell you another made-up story, this time as a demonstration of floral warfare. Let's name our main character, Lady Margaret. Lady Margaret described receiving an elaborate arrangement from the Countess of Warwick following a tense dinner party where the two had disagreed over a political matter. The bouquet appeared magnificent at first glance, a riot of color and texture that Lady Margaret initially took as a peace offering. However, upon closer examination with her Floriography dictionary in hand, Lady Margaret decoded a very different message. At the center was a yellow carnation, disappointment, surrounded by geraniums, stupidity, marigolds, grief, and foxglove, insincerity. The arrangement was bound with a yellow ribbon, symbolizing jealousy. The message was clear. I am disappointed by your stupid and insincere behavior, which causes me grief. All delivered in a beautiful arrangement that Lady Margaret had initially displayed prominently in her drawing room. Her diary records her response.
Received flowers from Warwick today. Appeared lovely until consultation with Mrs. Greenaway's guide revealed their true intent. Have instructed the maid to dispose of them immediately. Shall send a small arrangement of rue and basil in return tomorrow. Two can play at this game.
Rue symbolized regret, but specifically regret from the recipient rather than the sender, effectively saying, "You'll regret this." Combined with basil for hatred, Lady Margaret's response was equally cutting while maintaining perfect social decorum. Remember that position matters enormously. Any flower presented upside down means the opposite of its usual meaning, or a negative version of it. A ribbon tied to the left rather than the right can transform a message entirely. But perhaps the most subversive use of floriography wasn't found in these social skirmishes between equals. What happens when a coded language becomes a tool for those who otherwise have no voice? How might flowers speak for those who aren't permitted to speak for themselves?
Subversion and secret rebellion.
On the opening night of Lady Windermere's Fan, in February 1892, Oscar Wilde instructed a select group of his friends to wear green carnations in their buttonholes as they attended the premiere. This seemingly innocuous fashion choice carried profound significance. Green carnations do not exist in nature. These flowers had to be artificially dyed, creating something deliberately unnatural, a fitting symbol for a group of men who were forced by Victorian society to conceal their true natures. In an era when homosexuality was not merely socially unacceptable, but actively criminalized, the infamous Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 had made gross indecency between men punishable by up to 2 years of hard labor. Wilde and his circle needed coded ways to recognize one another. The green carnation became just such a code. It signified membership in a secret society of sorts, a quiet rebellion against Victorian sexual norms, and a private joke among those who understood its significance. It was rather brilliant when you think about it. What could be more innocent than a flower? The symbol gained wider recognition, perhaps too wide, when Robert Hichens published his novel, The Green Carnation, in 1894, a thinly veiled satire of Wilde and his relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas. The book made the connection between green carnations and homosexuality explicit enough that Wilde himself asked Hichens to withdraw it from circulation. fearing it would draw unwanted attention. His fears proved well-founded. Just 1 year later, in 1895, Wilde would be convicted under that same gross indecency law and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor, a punishment that broke his health and contributed to his early death in 1900. The green carnation remains perhaps the most famous example of floriography as subversion, a way for a marginalized group to communicate in plain sight, using the very conventions of Victorian society as a shield. If Victorian men faced restrictions, the constraints on women were even more severe. Proper ladies were expected to be demure, agreeable, and above all, obedient. First to fathers, then to husbands. Direct expression of opinions, desires, or warnings were often impossible without risking reputation or safety. Floriography offered women a rare form of agency in this restrictive environment. Through flowers, they could communicate messages that would have been forbidden if spoken aloud. Consider the case of Elizabeth Barrett, who before becoming Elizabeth Barrett Browning, used floriography to communicate with Robert Browning under the watchful eye of her controlling father. Her pressed flower albums reveal how she sent coded messages of affection and arranged secret meetings through carefully composed tussie-mousses delivered by sympathetic servants. But romantic communication was only one application. Perhaps more importantly, women used floriography to warn each other about dangerous men or situations. A young woman might receive a bouquet containing a yellow lily, falsehood, and foxglove, insincerity, from a friend, warning her about a suitor's true character. A married woman might send meadowsweet, uselessness, and rhododendron, danger, to a new bride, cautioning her about a husband known privately to be abusive. Floriography provided a safety net, allowing necessary messages to be exchanged while maintaining the appearance of proper feminine behavior. While the elaborate floriography of the upper classes required access to exotic blooms and expensive dictionaries, working-class Victorians developed their own adaptations of the flower language. Limited by what they could grow in small garden plots or find in the countryside, they focused on common flowers, herbs, and wildflowers. Their arrangements might lack the exotic orchids or imported blooms of wealthy practitioners, but they conveyed messages just as effectively. Working-class floriography often incorporated practical elements from cottage gardens. Rosemary for remembrance, thyme for courage, sage for wisdom. Herbs that served both culinary and medicinal purposes could also carry symbolic messages. Wildflowers, too, became important elements of this adapted language. Daisies, buttercups, clover, and dandelions, all freely available in fields and roadsides, were imbued with meanings and incorporated into simple posies. This democratization of floriography created parallel systems, the elaborate formal language of the wealthy existing alongside a simpler but equally meaningful practice among working people. While a duchess might send exotic orchids to convey a complex message, a factory girl might express the same sentiment with carefully arranged wildflowers. What's particularly fascinating is how these parallel systems occasionally intersect. Servants in great houses, exposed to both worlds, often served as translators and facilitators, helping to bridge the gap between different floral vocabularies.
A case study.
One remarkable example of subversive floriography comes from the diary of Hannah Culwick, a Victorian domestic servant who maintained a secret relationship with Arthur Munby, a gentleman from a much higher social class. Their relationship crossed rigid class boundaries and had to remain hidden for decades. Hannah's diary reveals how they used floriography to communicate safely, with Hannah adapting working-class flower meanings to send messages that would appear innocent to others in the household. When Hannah wished to arrange a meeting, she would ensure that Munby's room contained an arrangement featuring chickweed for rendezvous and specific numbers of leaves to indicate time. Her position as a servant gave her access to the household's flower arrangements, allowing her to communicate directly under the noses of her employers. Even the suffragettes movement of the late Victorian period adopted flowers as symbols. The colours white, purple and yellow were widely associated, and sunflowers, white camellia in New Zealand, and yellow roses were recognised as symbolic flowers for the cause. A woman wearing a purple iris might be simply following fashion, or she might be signalling her support for women's voting rights. Perhaps most poignant are the documented cases of floriography used in Victorian prisons and workhouses. Inmates with access to the institution's gardens would arrange simple wildflowers to convey messages to family members during strictly supervised visits. When words were forbidden or monitored, flowers could speak volumes. What else does this secret language tell us about the society that created it, and what happened when the rigid structures of Victorian life began to crumble?
The psychological and social significance.
Every human society develops methods of communication that circumvent its own restrictions. When direct expression is forbidden, indirect channels inevitably emerge. Victorian floriography represents a particularly beautiful example of this universal human tendency. The psychological pressure of living in a society that valued restraint above almost all else was immense. Victorians, particularly Victorian women, were expected to maintain rigid control over their emotions, desires, and opinions. Public displays of feeling were considered vulgar. Direct expression of romantic or sexual interest was scandalous. Yet human emotions cannot simply be suppressed indefinitely. They must find an outlet somewhere. Somehow, floriography provided that outlet, a pressure valve for a society ready to explode with unspoken feelings. Through flowers, Victorians could express what they could not say aloud: passion, disappointment, warning, encouragement, even rebellion. The elaborate code allowed for emotional honesty while maintaining the appearance of proper restraint. Floriography provided a safety net, allowing necessary emotional expression while preserving the social facade. What's particularly fascinating is how this coded communication may have actually intensified emotional experiences. There's a special thrill in sending or receiving a secret message, in knowing that you're communicating on a level invisible to most observers. The very restrictions that necessitated floriography may have made its emotional impact all the more powerful. Beyond the immediate communication of messages, floriography offered Victorians something equally valuable: a way to preserve emotional moments across time. The Victorian practice of pressing significant flowers in books and albums created silent time capsules of joy, heartbreak, and hope. A pressed forget-me-not might commemorate a first declaration of love. A dried orange blossom could preserve the memory of a wedding day. A faded rose might mark a passionate affair. These pressed flower albums weren't merely decorative, they were emotional archives, personal histories recorded in petals rather than words. Many such albums survive in museums and private collections, though we can only guess at the full stories they contain. The physical act of pressing and preserving flowers also served as a ritual of emotional processing. The careful arrangement of blooms, the patient waiting as they dried, the thoughtful placement in albums, all these steps allowed time for reflection and emotional integration. Perhaps most poignantly, pressed flowers offered a way to remember those who had passed. In an era of high mortality, when photography was still developing as a medium, a pressed flower from a loved one's funeral bouquet might be the most tangible memory keepsake available. Queen Victoria herself became the most famous practitioner of this memorial floriography. After Prince Albert's death in 1861, she preserved flowers from his funeral wreath and continued to press the annual lily of the valley bouquets she placed beside his portrait. These preserved blooms became physical manifestations of her enduring grief and love. As the Victorian era gave way to the Edwardian and then the tumultuous early 20th century, the elaborate practice of floriography began to fade. Several factors contributed to its decline. First came changing social norms. The rigid chaperoning and strict separation of unmarried men and women gradually relaxed. Direct communication became more acceptable, reducing the need for coded messages. The First World War accelerated these changes dramatically. The unprecedented disruption of established social structures, the entry of women into previously male workplaces, and the general questioning of pre-war conventions all contributed to a more direct communication style. Technological developments played a role as well. The telephone, though initially limited to the wealthy, offered a new way to communicate privately. The increasing affordability of photography provided alternative methods of preserving memories. The sudden collapse of floriography's popularity was much like a brolly on a blustery British beach. By the 1920s, while flowers remained important for special occasions, the intricate knowledge of their symbolic meanings had largely been lost. What had once been common knowledge became a historical curiosity, preserved in dusty dictionaries rather than active practice. This loss represents more than just the fading of a quaint Victorian custom. It marked the disappearance of an entire communication system, a rich, nuanced language that had allowed for expression when direct speech was impossible. Despite the general decline of floriography as a comprehensive system, certain flower meanings have persisted into modern times. Our modern flower-giving practices, while simplified, echo Victorian traditions in many ways. We still select specific blooms for specific occasions. Red roses remain firmly associated with romantic love. White lilies continue to symbolize purity or sympathy, and are still common at funerals. Orange blossoms, thanks to Queen Victoria's influence, maintain their connection to weddings and marriage. We may not be consciously using the Victorian language, but its influence lingers. What's particularly interesting is how some meanings have evolved. Yellow roses, once symbols of jealousy and infidelity in Victorian floriography, are now generally given to express friendship and joy. The negative connotation has been almost entirely lost. Of course, we've developed and continued to evolve our own modern coded communication systems. The anxiety one suffers trying to interpret emoji meanings isn't so different from Victorian attempts to decode floral messages. Does that heart emoji indicate romantic interest or just friendly affection? Is that winky face flirtatious or sarcastic? Is that aubergine merely a suggestion for dinner? The technology changes, but the human need for nuanced communication remains. The Victorian language of flowers represents far more than a quaint historical curiosity. It stands as a testament to human ingenuity in the face of restriction, our endless capacity to find ways to express what must be expressed, even when direct communication is forbidden. In its complexity, its beauty, and its occasional darkness, floriography perfectly encapsulates Victorian society itself. A culture of outward restraint and inner passion, of rigid rules and secret rebellions, of scientific classification and romantic symbolism. The next time you give or receive flowers, perhaps pause to consider their possible meanings beyond their visual appeal. That bouquet might not contain a secret message in the Victorian sense, but it carries emotional significance nonetheless, a tangible expression of feelings that sometimes words alone cannot convey. In our world of instant messaging and video calls, there's something rather poignant about communication through flowers, a slower, more deliberate exchange that requires thought, knowledge, and care in both creation and interpretation. Perhaps we modern humans could learn something from the Victorians' careful attention to the nuances of communication, their appreciation for subtlety, and their understanding that sometimes the most powerful messages are those conveyed without words. After all, in a world increasingly dominated by direct, immediate communication, couldn't we all use a bit more of the beauty, mystery, and thoughtful intention that Floriography embodied? The language of flowers may have faded from common knowledge, but its essential purpose, finding beauty and meaning in what cannot be directly expressed, remains as relevant today as it was in Queen Victoria's drawing room. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe to help our channel bloom.